Well, good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to those of you over the pond. Good to see you all up bright and early this morning. My name is Alec Jones. I'm a member of the ESPRit Organising Committee, and I have the great pleasure of welcoming you all to the third ESPRit online seminar in the second series and the last before the holidays. I'm delighted in particular to welcome our two speakers, and I'd like to thank them in advance for bringing such fascinating work to our collective attention here today. We again are going to have two papers and two very different sets of case studies. Both papers, I think you'll find, are going to be richly illustrated and will touch on broadly similar themes: cross-border, cross-cultural, cross-language traffic, and the effects of these transitions on periodical style, content production, and readership. We'll also be picking up issues, I think, about professionalization, technical change, industrialization, commercialization, and the making of urban middle-class tastes and identities in two quite distinct locations. So, rich fare indeed ahead of us, and a fair bit of comparative social history as well, which I think personally is a very good thing. As in our previous online seminars, the two papers will follow on from each other, which should leave us with a good 20 minutes for questions and discussions. And I hope we can also then weave some of these common threads together a bit before we end at the top of the hour. As always, please keep your mics muted, unless of course you're speaking, and your cameras off during the presentations. But please do make use of the chat facility to make a brief comment or to log in your questions while the speakers are presenting. Depending on your responses, of course, I'll probably start the Q&A session with those comments and questions in chat. So, moving briskly along, our first speaker is Yelizaveta Raykhlina, who is an adjunct assistant professor at New York University's Liberal Studies faculty. Lisa received her PhD in history from Grangetown University in 2018 for a thesis that examined the Russian language newspaper The Northern Bee and the journal Library for Reading as sources to explore what she terms the middle stratum culture from the mid 1820s to the early 1860s, arguing that a non-elite reading marketplace had formed earlier than previously thought and had a wider reach than formerly acknowledged. She's now working on her dissertation turned monograph entitled The Birth of Imperial Russia's Commercial Press, Periodicals, Publics, and Social Identity in the Age of Pushkin and Dostoevsky. And she has two articles forthcoming in the coming year, in 2022, one on the language of class in Russian newspapers from 1825 to 1855, and another on satire in the 1840s illustrated press. So Lisa, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Aled, and thank you, Mikey, and the European Society for Periodical Research. Thank you for hosting me. So this presentation is, it's an outgrowth of my dissertation. This isn't what I actually wrote my dissertation on, but it's a set of journals and magazines and female publishers and journalists who I discovered in the process of writing the dissertation. So today's presentation explores a little bit of that. It explores the emergence of a professionalized and commercialized Russian language women's press in the late 1830s and 1840s, focusing on how the illustrated fashion magazine functioned as an arena for translating and adapting French fashions for Russian readers. These years serve as a turning point for women's magazines in Imperial Russia, as they mark the emergence of the first fashion magazines to be founded by women entrepreneurs. The presentation examines two publisher editors, Mariia Nikolaevna Koshelevskaia and Elizaveta Safonova, the entrepreneurs who founded Herald of Parisian Fashions, and I'll use all the titles in translation, which published from 1836 to 1850, and Pages for High Society, which published from 1839 to 1845 in its first iteration and actually continued until the late 1850s in its second and third iterations. Both Safonova and Koshelevskaia had non-noble origins, and both had the unusual role of reporting on French fashion to Moscow and Petersburg elites, and importantly to provincial readers, noble women living in the provinces, and also wealthy merchant women. And both broke new ground in creating periodicals for women and putting their magazines on a professional footing. Koshelevskaia and Safonova also found ways to translate foreign styles to Russian needs, and to a smaller or larger degree made their magazines relevant to a broader conversation taking place across the Russian press about defining Russian culture. So until the 1830s, women's magazines in Russia were actually literary journals. There was essentially no illustration. These were journals of fiction, nonfiction, poetry, and so on. And they were published and edited and written by men, usually of noble origins, and often they didn't last very long. They usually disappeared after their first year of publication. They weren't commercially viable. The very first women's journal in Russia debuted in 1779 in St. Petersburg under the title Fashion Monthly, or Reading for Ladies' Couture, under the editorship of Nikolai Novikov, who was the most prolific publisher in Russia in the 18th century. Novikov moved to Moscow midway through 1779 and published the Fashion Monthly out of the leased press at Moscow University. But the journal shut down in December, again, for lack of commercial viability. 7 more women's periodicals appeared between Novikov's Fashion Monthly and that debut and the beginning of the 1830s, all with a noble readership in mind, and all but one having a print run of 1 or 2 years. The exception was the Ladies' Journal, published in Moscow from 1823 to 1833 by the nobleman Pyotr Sharikov, who published early female poets. Now, an important shift occurred when major journals and newspapers debuting in the 1820s and catering to whole families, so these sort of general interest publications that had something for everyone, notably the Petersburg newspaper Northern Bee and journal Moscow Telegraph, when they began to regularly print content specifically for women, particularly book reviews with women in mind, and illustrated fashion plate supplements. The one you see here on the screen is actually from the microfilm that I took a copy of at the Library of Congress. Usually, and this is in the vast majority of cases, the supplements don't survive because people would pull them out, they would use them, they would pin them up on the wall. So they don't really exist. So this is kind of a rare find. And this is the Moscow Telegraph Journal. This also had plates, and on the right image, it actually explains what's in the plates that are accompanying the journal, but the plates are missing, so we don't actually see them. We only get the description, but they were there. Now, the professionalization and commercialization of the Russian press that took place in the late 1820s impacted the women's magazine as well. Parallel to processes happening in Europe in the early 19th century, Russian publishing underwent professionalization in the 1820s that effectively created the journalist, the profession of the journalist. And professionalization included acquiring knowledgeable staff, procuring equipment and materials, adhering to a regular publishing schedule, standardizing payments to writers, and seeking, though not always securing, timely delivery to subscribers. And for the first time in the history of the Russian press, journalism became a profession that could provide a significant yearly income. And that enabled non-nobles to enter the field as writers, as editors, publishers, and sort of all-around journalists who did all of the above. And professionalization was made possible by the increasing commercialization of the press and the expansion of readerships beyond the elite and courtly circles, which in turn was due to changes occurring in Russian education. This is going back to the reforms of Catherine II, or Catherine the Great, and the expansion of the bureaucracy and the participation of the middling estates, which in the Russian case included literate merchants and townspeople, clergy, so-called personal nobles. These are individuals given nobility, but it's not hereditary, and low-rank civil servants. Their participation in the reading economy effectively created the market for periodicals. Now, bibliographic listings from the late imperial period tell us that in 1831, a women's magazine titled The Vase was founded in St. Petersburg. The Vase, we are told, included illustrations and patterns for embroidery and was one of the longest running women's magazines. Actually, it ran until 1884. But it's also one of the most enigmatic, because the most comprehensive bibliography of periodicals published actually in 1915 by N.M. Lisowski tells us that, quote, "We do not have information about this journal from 1831 to 1847, but we are told at some point Safonova became its publisher editor after she moved to Petersburg in 1838. In other words, the Vase may be the first periodical founded by a woman, but we don't know the journal's original publisher, as was actually usually the case with women-founded periodicals. They're usually absent from these kinds of records, unless you go into the archives. So the first magazine of women's fashions to have a confirmed female founder was the Herald of Parisian Fashions, published and edited by Mariia Nikolaevna Koshelevskaia. Koshelevskaia was born into a family of architects and engineers, although her father had Don Cossack roots. Her father, Nikolai, was educated in St. Petersburg during the reign of Catherine II, graduating from the Academy of Arts and participating in the construction of key Petersburg landmarks before being transferred to Moscow. The little that is known about Koshelevskaia comes to us through biographies and accounts of her father, but even more importantly, her prominent nephew, Vladimir Osipovich Sherwood, who was an architect and painter famous for designing the State Historical Museum in Moscow. This was sort of the height of Russian revival, right, in the late 19th century, among other landmarks. So it's through reading about Sherwood that we find out about Koshelevskaia. Now, we know that Koshelevskaia was born in Moscow in 1815, and that in 1836, at the age of 21, she launched the Herald of Parisian Fashions as a dual Russian and French language magazine, with material translated from French fashion periodicals. The magazine included embroidery patterns and colored plates of fashions said to be worn by Parisian high society. We don't have subscription numbers, and we don't have an archive devoted to Koshelevskaia's magazine, although surely, and this is something for future scholarship and research, there are census reports that can be found. But we can reconstruct the intended reader to some degree. Koshelevskaia clearly had Moscow and Petersburg high society in mind with this publication, but the side-by-side Russian and French language articles point to an audience of the middling gentry and upper merchantry. The Russian translations benefited those who couldn't read French, while the presence of French on the magazine's pages gave it authority as a messenger of Parisian fashion. The magazine's long print run from 1836 to 1850 also indicates that it was supported by subscribers from the provinces. mostly nobles, but also merchants and possibly some civil servants and their wives, because Russia's economy its wealth rather was concentrated in the provinces. And the bulk of subscribers to all periodicals in the middle third of the 19th century, so certainly before the Great Reforms, actually came from the areas outside of Petersburg and Moscow. Now, Koshelevskaia closed the Herald of Parisian Fashions in 1850 and launched a short-lived magazine called the Fashion and Needlework magazine in 1851. But her timing was poor as Russia's participation in the Crimean War impacted the nobility's finances, the Russian economy, and so on. And Koshelevskaia had to shut it down in 1854. Just as we know little about her life before her publishing ventures, we know equally little about her life after 1854. Lisowski's bibliography hypothesizes that Koshelevskaia published 2 additional fashion magazines in 1857 and 1860, but the Koshelevsky family archive in Moscow and the archives of the Moscow Press Censors Committee should tell us more about this fascinating pioneer in women's publishing. Now, while Koshelevskaia may have introduced the first dual-language women's magazine, illustrated women's magazine in Russia, it was Yelizaveta Safonova who found a successful formula in both translating and adapting French tastes to Russian readers. We know that Safonova published several women's magazines in her lifetime, although we know little about Safonova herself. Late imperial journals list her as a publisher-editor and state that her husband, Safonov, was a civil servant of the 10th rank. Now, in the imperial table of ranks, 14 was the lowest, and a 10th rank bureaucrat was solidly middling and not a noble. Now, we do not know Safonova's maiden name, although her patronymic, Fransovna, tells us that her father's name was Franz, and thus in all likelihood a foreigner, probably German. The first confirmed magazine she launched was in Moscow in 1836 under the title Magazine of New Sewing, which she renamed in 1838 after she moved to St. Petersburg. And in 1839, Safonova launched Pages. And Pages for High Society was an entirely new kind of magazine. It moved beyond the plates and patterns seen in Safonova's earlier sewing magazine or in Koshelevskaia's Heralds, for that matter, because it included articles on how Parisian fashions were received in Petersburg, how women were dressing on Nevsky Prospect, which was Petersburg's main shopping street. And it included articles on the history of fashion as well. Safonova's magazine also included recommendations for stores and tailors in Petersburg, which would have been useful for city residents, but more importantly, for Russians coming from the provinces who needed a guidebook of addresses and names. And the magazine critically evaluated French fashions, sometimes disagreeing that a certain trend would work or that it would even be practical in Russia's climate. In turn, Petersburg fashion was depicted as its own domain, with the magazine inviting readers to evaluate if a certain Parisian trend transposed to Petersburg was worthy of emulation in the provinces. So here on the left, you have an ad, actually. It lists three fashion stores, and the one on the right depicts a riding habit that's popular among aristocratic women in Petersburg at the time. The magazine thus claimed a critical eye, reporting on Parisian fashions. Indeed, it sourced most of its color plates directly from Paris, but proclaimed an objectivity and a discerning taste that appealed to its readers. Now, the launch of Pages for High Society and its contact with the network of Petersburg writers may have had something to do with Safonova's brother-in-law. The Russian fashion historian Tatyana Vladimirovna Rudenko proposes that Safonova was likely the sister-in-law of the merchant turned journalist Nikolai Polyevoy, who was the former editor of the major journal Moscow Telegraph, which I showed a couple of slides back. That was shut down in 1834 for a critical review that displeased Tsar Nicholas I. And Polyevoy's diary mentions a relative named Lisa, which is short form for Yelizaveta, asking for assistance with her journal in 1839. Polyevoy, who moved to St. Petersburg with his wife Natalia Frantsovna, same patronymic there, in 1836, after his journal was closed, may have connected Safonova to his network of Petersburg publishers and writers. Safonova's name, and this is very interesting, did not appear in Pages for High Society. Its title page stated that it was printed under the supervision of the prominent publisher Adolf Plusher. And Nikolai Polyevoy and his brother Xenophon had worked with Plusher and may have helped arrange business affairs and attach Plusher's name to the periodical, to Safonova's periodical for marketing purposes. But we found archival records for this journal, and it is only through those archival records that we even know that Safonova was actually behind this magazine. Now, in contrast to the narrower scope of Koshelevskaia's Herald of Parisian Fashions, Safonova's Pages for High Society took on a broader mission to engage its readers in a conversation about what it meant to create a Russian style. This was perhaps unsurprising for a Russian periodical in the late 1830s and early 1840s, when ethnographic illustrations and the newly popular physiological sketch suddenly dominated the pages of magazines, journals, and newspapers. Defining Russianness had been a challenge for Russia's elites ever since Peter I, Peter the Great, initiated a rapid program of Westernization in the early 18th century. But that challenge was not taken up in the public arena until a commercial and professionalized press emerged in the late 1820s. Typified by the split among Russia's leading writers and critics into a Westernizer and Slavophile camp in the 1830s, the attempt to define Russianness found itself in all genres of print media, including women's magazines. Safonova's Pages for High Society found its own answer in hybridization and adaptation, critically evaluating foreign trends for their viability on Russian soil. Moreover, the magazine not only compared French and Russian ideas of fashion, but also turned inward to look at Russian society, merging for the first time the physiological sketch with the fashion press. The years 1843 and 1844 featured satirical illustrations by Vasily Tim, a Baltic German lithographer who was a close acquaintance of Nikolai Polyevoy. Tim provided commentary on topics ranging from women smoking, and I do love this image, to noblemen's drinking and gambling, as you see here, in the zoomed in snippets, to the alcoholism and domestic violence rampant among the urban lower classes. You see that here, so domestic violence in figure 24, drunkenness in figure 25, 26. Safonova's Pages for High Society was renamed in 1846 to Magazine of Paris Fashions and renamed again in 1851 to Fashion Pages for High Society. And in 1851, Safonova stepped away from publishing and editing the magazine. We don't know why. And the story of this third iteration of Pages for High Society can be found in historian Christine Ruan's article in the groundbreaking collective anthology of women's journalism titled An Improper Profession. But this presentation highlights an earlier and virtually unstudied period in women's journalism in the 1830s and early 1840s, when the professionalization and commercialization of the Russian press made it possible to live off the income generated by subscriptions, and thus made publishing a possibility for Russians beyond the salon circles of the nobility. So to conclude, translating French, English, and German language periodicals was a feature of Russian publishing from its very beginnings in the 18th century. But adapting, hybridizing, and localizing foreign language periodicals to Russian readers became a possibility and a necessity only when the Russian reading market expanded beyond the readership of the upper nobility. The commercialization of the Russian press and the emergence of the profession of the journalist in the 1820s was a process occurring across genres, from newspapers to literary journals to women's magazines. It was also a process that had its parallels in other European presses. And the Russian case presents us with a variation on a much broader theme. While the Russian women's magazine is an area of very recent and very much developing scholarship, I hope this talk has stimulated interest in pursuing this area further. Thank you so much.